Welcome to Exhausting Stories, where history helps you drift into sleep. Tonight, we invite you to sink into a royal tale not often told, one that begins with a love story, but hides something far more dangerous. What if the most famous romance in British royal history was actually a smokescreen? Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson's forbidden love shook an empire, but behind palace doors, whispers of betrayal stirred. Whispers not of love, but of loyalty, prestige to forces whose influence could have changed the fate of World War II. What if Edward's abdication wasn't just about the heart, but about power, politics, and secret sympathies best left buried? As you lie back and close your eyes, we'll gently explore a story erased from history books, one too dangerous for its time. Congested, before we begin, please subscribe and like this video. It truly helps more dreamers find our channel. The fire, submerged by the ease your thoughts. Let the hush of history carry you. Let the story begin. In December 1936, a choice shook the foundations of the British monarchy. Edward VIII, the man once celebrated as a modern, charismatic symbol of royalty, announced his decision to give up the throne. His reason? Love. Wallis Simpson, the American socialite with sharp wit and a reputation as an unconventional matchmaker, had captured Edward's heart. There was just one problem. Wallis was divorced, twice in fact, and her living ex-husbands cast a long shadow over her relationship with a king. Her status as an American also raised eyebrows within a royal family bound by old-world customs. But was this romance the whole story? Or was it a perfect storm of love and politics, with the former used to obscure darker truths? Edward's rise to the throne began as one of promise. Handsome, charming, and personally invested in connecting with the public, he was unlike any monarch before him. The flashy headlines in the press celebrated him as the Playboy Prince during his years as the Prince of Wales, an image that enamored many. Edward frequented society gatherings, dazzled onlookers, and exuded a sense of accessibility, qualities that stood in stark contrast to the air of aloofness typically associated with his role. But even with his popularity, there were murmurs. Beneath the polished facade was a man who resisted the burdens of duty. He famously described his life as one that belonged to the office, not to himself, revealing the tension between his personal desires and the expectations placed upon him. When news of Wallis and Edward's affair surfaced, it quickly became a sensation bound to spark intrigue and, inevitably, outrage. Wallis was enigmatic, with her confidence and modern style sitting uneasily in a society steeped in tradition. She was not the image of a queen consort that the British establishment was prepared to embrace. Publicly, she was vilified as an opportunist aiming to climb the royal ladder. It wasn't just tabloids that wielded these accusations. Members of the royal family reportedly viewed her influence over Edward as a threat, hinting she encroached on matters outside her purview. British society was rigidly structured at the time, and while today these barriers between royal personages and commoners feel less defined, in Wallis's era they were meant to be unbreachable. The marriage wasn't merely a personal milestone, but a constitutional crisis. As head of the Church of England, a monarch was expected to embody certain moral and spiritual standards. Divorce, for its part, was considered not just a personal failure, but a religious dilemma, framing Wallis's past relationships as incompatible with the expectations of royal decorum. Although lascivious rumours about her dominated headlines in parts of Europe and America, British newspapers remained surprisingly silent, on orders from British authorities who controlled what the public could openly read about their sovereign. Still, whispers about the seriousness of Edward's attachment to Wallis circulated. It became clear something had to give. Edward proved unwilling to separate his private life from his public role. In a dramatic radio address delivered to the British public, he uttered words that would become permanently etched into the story. "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." His abdication speech painted a portrait of deep personal sacrifice, handing the throne to his younger brother, who had become George VI. there was an undeniably poetic streak to his decision. A king surrendering his crown for love was the stuff of legend. The public listened enraptured, picturing Edward and Wallis as star-crossed lovers whose bond transcended titles and tradition. The cultural weight of this story was enormous. At a time when most people lived tightly defined lives, tethered to public expectations and societal norms, Edward's choice appeared both audacious and romantic. Films, songs, and novels reflected on the beauty of selfless love. Imagine yourself sitting by the crackling warmth of a 1930s radio, hearing those words of devotion from a king who most would have expected to prioritize the crown over his own happiness. Surprising or not, the narrative fit perfectly into the collective longing for timeless romance. For decades after the abdication, this would remain the dominant account of Edward's departure from the monarchy. But behind this public-facing melodrama, threads began to unravel. Why Wallis? Why so much scandal surrounding her relationship with Edward? And why, after stepping down, did Edward find himself viewed with suspicion by those who had once campaigned to shield his reputation? It's here, in the shadows, that we see the outlines of a far more complex truth, one concealed under layers of myth, public spectacle, and deliberate misdirection. The last challenge, the last jalem, was ultimate spared were not taking on release of Coit. It turns out, Edward's sense of self-determination didn't emerge in isolation during his romance with Wallis. Before the abdication, his individualism had already begun to raise concerns within Buckingham Palace and Parliament alike. Even his father, King George V, expressed fears that Edward would bring ruin were he left to carry the throne's weight. If Wallis had not existed, would Edward have remained on the throne as one of Britain's more unconventional rulers, refusing to navigate alliances and traditional diplomacy in favour of personal preference? Given what we know now about his political leanings and apparent despise for formality, some historians suggest that his deposition might merely have been delayed under different circumstances. Hints that Edward's abdication served as convenient timing for the monarchy to sideline a potential liability instead of solely as the consequence of romantic passion are hard to ignore. By the time the love story took over front pages from New York to Paris, there was already a deeper political undercurrent at play. Edward met Wallis in the lead-up to his coronation, but political advisors around him constrained their commentary in exchange for managing more troubling actions Edward had enacted or engaged within his political connections. Consider the distraction his story provided. People around the world fixated on personal choices, cloaked in resignation letters and media fervour. It gave the appearance that the monarchy had weathered catastrophe, but historians studying the atmosphere of pre-war Europe suspect this preoccupation created an opportunity to deflect closer examinations of Edward's underlying attitudes during this critical moment. Far from shielded, Edward stirred a worldwide response aligning loyalty and controversial neutrality against the looming threats. Even before his abdication publicly fractured continuity, historically assumed to glue monarchy together. This wasn't entirely lost on leaders like Stanley Baldwin, desperately preventing both Edward from budding rebellion abroad post-approval. Yet hearings twisting keys to representing monarchical stability undermined monarch continuous loyalty. Untangling puzzle work, outside gaze, lost explanation, overlapping tropes transplanted, leaving gaps unresolved, yet systematically cloaking shadow whispers. Onward decades continued minor erasure afterward. Almost perfect spectacle achieved. Across oceans, yet within striking fear-bound pressures, nations echoed outsizing Edward removing. Taken, rain adjustment remarks afterward. Loops expanded, complex tangle manipulation full, better grasped, forthcoming. Moments describing revealing cloudbursts. Hints earlier errors unravel refusal sought bounds. Edward Simpson messages. Calcified, sanitized, hindsight staged, acceptability, reconcile nearly final adjustment. Why did Edward VIII's political views make Britain uneasy long before Wallis entered the picture? Perhaps the warnings could already be found in his early life, an upbringing shaped more by royal expectation than intellectual rigor. As the eldest son of King George V, Edward was always destined for the throne. His parents, however, maintained the distant, formal relationship typical of royals at the time. His father was stern, his mother more affectionate, but often preoccupied with duty. For Edward, the warmth of close family bonds was absent, replaced by rigid discipline and the pressures of eventual kingship. Even his education reflected this. Tailored more for tradition than substance, it placed an emphasis on social presentation rather than cultivating true political understanding. This left Edward unprepared for the kind of monarch his role would demand. By 15, after unexpectedly becoming the heir upon the death of his older brother, he entered a world of responsibility that would test his character. Most biographies highlight a sense of disinterest that lingered throughout his years as Prince of Wales, while he mastered public appearances, charming crowds and projecting an image of modernity. His attitude toward the technicalities of governance was notoriously lax. Ministers often noted his reluctance to engage with state papers or focus on the affairs of the realm. Edward preferred leisure, travel, and the party circles of London to the tedious rituals required of a king in waiting. It was clear that while he had inherited his father's throne, he did not share George V's work ethic or respect for tradition. This aversion to convention extended beyond his personal life. Edward vocalized a dislike for the democratic processes underpinning Britain's political system, viewing them as slow and inadequate for the rapidly changing modern world. His admiration leaned more toward approaches that centralize power, cutting through the inefficiencies he associated with parliamentarianism. At first, these comments were dismissed as naivete, but over time, they mirrored certain global currents gaining traction. By the mid-1930s, authoritarian regimes were rising across Europe, and Edward's apparent sympathy for their methods alarmed those around him. Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, who worked closely with Edward during his brief reign, was among those acutely aware of the potential problems. Numerous accounts describe Baldwin's efforts to mentor the king, trying to guide him toward the sense of duty and stability expected of the monarch. Yet, Edward's discontent with those expectations became clear to anyone paying attention. He openly admired the economic reforms of Adolf Hitler's Germany and spoke positively about their results. While other leaders warned of the looming Nazi threat, Edward applauded Germany's recovery from its economic devastation, even suggesting Britain should extend the hand of friendship. To his father, King George V, such statements were infuriating. George, a pragmatic figure, understood the delicate balance Britain needed to maintain in a Europe under political strain, and Edward upset that balance with his remarks. The concern didn't end with his fondness for Germany's recovery. Edward's personal comments often displayed an almost callous disregard for the principles of democracy. In private conversations, he reportedly praised the discipline of authoritarian governments, implying Britain's system should learn from their example. Though such statements were never made publicly, those within the government and the monarchy itself began to see a troubling pattern. Growing tension in Europe only amplified these fears, with advisors increasingly wary of how Edward would behave as king should Britain face conflict. One particularly unsettling instance occurred during the Rhineland crisis in March 1936, shortly after Edward became king. Germany under Hitler had breached the Treaty of Versailles by remilitarizing the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone set up as a buffer after World War I. The move tested Europe's resolve, especially Britain and France. Edward, however, chose a different stance. Far from condemning the violation, he urged the British government not to intervene. To his advisors and to Baldwin, this went beyond diplomatic caution. It appeared to support the kind of aggression that other European leaders were trying to curb. Edward even went as far as to threaten abdication if Britain took military action, a bold stance that only reinforced suspicions about where his loyalties lay. Behind the scenes, the British government's concerns about Edward's behaviour began to solidify into action. It wasn't just his political comments, but his general carelessness with matters of state. Reports circulated about Edward's casual attitude towards sensitive documents, including war plans and diplomatic correspondence, which he sometimes left unattended. Advisors and officials feared this lack of discretion made him a liability, particularly as tensions in Europe escalated. Matters weren't helped by rumours regarding the influence Wallis Simpson already seemed to wield over him by 1936. Though they had yet to marry, whispers about Wallis's connections circulated, fueled by her rumoured ties to figures in Germany. Some of the more extreme accusations even painted her as a potential Nazi spy, a claim intensified by Edward's trust in her judgment. Edward's father had long warned about these tendencies. George V once predicted that Edward would ruin himself in 12 months if he ever became king. While the prediction proved overly dramatic, Edward lasted nearly a year on the throne. The sentiment captured the unease he inspired, even among his own family. His younger brother Albert, later George VI, internalized those warnings, shaping his own reign around the quiet stability that Edward so lacked. Meanwhile, Churchill, although friendly toward Edward personally, began to recognize his politics as dangerous, if only because they were unpredictable and dismissive of Britain's constitutional norms. What was clear to advisers and ministers, though little understood by the British public at the time, was that Edward's politics didn't exist in a vacuum. His flirtation with authoritarian ideals overlapped with his larger disinterest in bearing the restrictions of monarchy. He seemed to view the royal position as a personal platform, not a national institution, ignoring the nuanced role British kings were expected to play as constitutional icons rather than autocrats. Baldwin and key figures within the government began to weigh the risks of Edward remaining on the throne indefinitely. Baldwin has been noted in diaries of Churchill discussing hints towards similar in sheer discontent. As concerns mounted, Edward's interactions with foreign powers highlighted just how serious the situation could become. His preference for bypassing traditional diplomatic channels and his apparent fascination with German methods left senior officials deeply uneasy about his ability to lead Britain through looming international crises. Publicly, none of this was acknowledged, with the romantic narrative dominating debates about Edward's suitability as king. But privately, the question of his politics loomed larger than ever. Unsurprisingly, by the time Wallis Simpson entered the public spotlight, she became both a convenient scapegoat and a genuine complicating factor. Some historians argue that Edward's abdication may have been inevitable, regardless of his relationship with her. The government's handling of his resignation struck a delicate balance, painting it solely as a matter of personal love, rather than the combination of political missteps that truly forced their hand. Yet, the cracks in Edward's image were already forming long before the drama of his abdication unfolded. Edward's political leanings eventually translated into direct actions that would raise public eyebrows if fully revealed, particularly during his post-abdication years. Before we explore the infamous trip that cemented his reputation as a direct threat to Britain's wartime efforts, it's worth asking a chilling question. How might history have changed if Edward remained king during the heated years leading up to World War II? It's October 1937 and the sky is overcast as a train rolls into Berlin. On board are Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, and Wallis Simpson, stepping onto German soil just months after their marriage. Their smiles hint at a sense of occasion, a moment they no doubt see as one of diplomacy, perhaps even significance. But the reception that greets them is anything but ordinary. This isn't simply a private visit, as it has been framed. Waiting for them is an entourage that includes key Nazi officials, banners displaying swastikas flying high and crowds orchestrated to cheer their arrival. Despite being just a former king and his controversial bride, Edward and Wallis are treated as though they still carry the weight of the British crown. Even at the platform, the purpose of this trip begins to reveal itself. Dr. Robert Ley, head of the German Labour Front, and Joachim von Ribbentrop, Germany's ambassador to the United Kingdom at the time, offer warm and formal greetings. For Edward and Wallis, this is the start of a tightly choreographed 12-day tour of Nazi Germany, a journey that would soon ripple across Europe as a major propaganda victory for the Third Reich. Officially, it was framed as a private visit, an opportunity for Edward and Wallis to observe Germany's industrial and economic progress firsthand. But as they travelled, One couldn't ignore the ways in which the trip highlighted Edward's continued influence and the Nazis' desire to exploit it. The itinerary was carefully curated to impress. Edward and Wallis inspected gleaming factories, met German workers, and toured government installations designed to highlight the efficiency and rebirth of the Nazi regime. This was a Germany emerging from the shadows of World War I, rebuilding itself with staggering speed under the leadership of Adolf Hitler. Edward, for his part, didn't disguise his admiration. He saw in German industries what he believed were signs of progress and modernity, a stark contrast to what he had criticized as Britain's sluggish recovery. To further this image of transformation, the couple was even taken to a newly constructed facility to demonstrate Germany's economic ingenuity. Its true purpose as a concentration camp was concealed, leaving Edward aboard a staged version of German renewal. As they travelled, the hospitality extended to them only grew. Lavish receptions and carefully arranged photo opportunities treated Edward almost as if he were still king. They dined with high-ranking officials, including Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi Minister of Propaganda, and Hermann Goering, whose presence tied the visit directly to Hitler's inner circle. These encounters were notable not just for their symbolism, but for what they revealed. At one event, Edward was seen performing the infamous Nazi salute, a gesture largely overlooked by the sanitized British press, but widely reported internationally. His willingness to engage with Nazi leaders on such familiar terms sent shockwaves back home. The British authorities could only imagine the political fallout if these images reached the public. For Germany, however, Edward's open gestures served as confirmation of his sympathies, or at least of a useful partnership. The crescendo of this visit came when Edward and Wallis met Adolf Hitler at the Berghof, Hitler's retreat hidden in the mountains of Bavaria. There, high above the trees and removed from the constraints of formality, Edward and the Führer sat down for a private conversation. No witnesses recorded what was said in those hours, and no official minutes were preserved. In fact, whatever notes existed from the meeting were deliberately destroyed, leaving only speculation about what transpired. What we do know is that photographs of Edward shaking Hitler's hand were circulated as propaganda, plastered across German newspapers as part of the regime's campaign to project legitimacy and international support for its policies. For Edward, these moments may have been another effort to position himself as a global thinker and mediator. For Hitler, they were a gift, a chance to suggest that even former British royalty saw value in his vision for Europe. It wasn't just the Nazis who noticed the opportunity Edward represented. The visit was orchestrated, in part, by figures outside both the British and German governments, who hoped to elevate Edward's standing. Among them was Charles Badeau, an industrial millionaire known for his sympathies toward Nazi ideology. Badeau had a personal interest in fostering connections between Edward and the Third Reich, seeing the former king as someone who could play a pivotal role in softening relations between Britain and Germany. Badeau was joined in these efforts by Swedish millionaire Axel Wenner-Gren, who had also aligned himself with German ambitions. Together, they saw Edward as a potential bridge between two nations on the brink of conflict. The trip was a success from Germany's perspective, but it left British officials stunned. King George VI, Edward's younger brother, regarded the visit as nothing short of a catastrophe. Officials referred to it as a bombshell, punctuating their growing fears about Edward's role on the global stage. Although Edward no longer held a crown, the symbolism of his trip carried weight. Not only had he aligned himself publicly with a regime that Britons were increasingly viewing as a threat, but he had also undermined the royal family's efforts to distance itself from him. For British intelligence and government officials, this trip confirmed their fears. Edward was not just careless, but dangerously sympathetic to an adversary. In Britain, the media coverage starkly contrasted with the tone of international headlines. Domestic outlets, bound by a cultural and legal reluctance to openly criticize members of the royal family. Tread lightly. Reports framed the trip as personal and essentially irrelevant to politics. But foreign papers were less restrained. In the United States and Europe, headlines highlighted Edward's apparent warmth toward the Nazi leadership, presenting him as a potential ally of Hitler. Within days, the British government had to contend with damage control, emphasizing that Edward's actions reflected no official position of the crown or the nation. Yet this shift in perception proved difficult to undo. For Hitler, the visit had accomplished more than he likely dreamed. Edward, with his royal connections and influence, had willingly allowed himself to become part of Nazi propaganda. To someone like Joseph Goebbels, the architect of much of the Nazi Party's messaging, Edward was not merely a former king, he was an asset. His visible approval of Nazi hospitality and policies could be weaponized, used as evidence that Germany's vision for Europe was both admirable and inevitable. The implications of the visit extended far beyond the scope of Edward's image. For British intelligence, the trip confirmed that Edward was not only a liability, but a security risk of the highest order. Reports surfaced in later years suggesting that Nazis saw Edward as a potential ally in securing favourable peace terms should England and Germany come to war. The idea of Edward returning to the throne as a puppet monarch was not dismissed, but actively explored by figures within Hitler's regime. Edward, either oblivious to these machinations or simply uninterested in the consequences, further cemented doubts about his judgment. This trip would mark a turning point. No longer seen as an innocent exile pushed out by love, Edward began to appear as something darker, a man whose actions showed a troubling alignment with forces his former country would soon fight to stop. His 1937 visit was deeply revealing, not merely for its optics, but for the questions it raised about his loyalties. What might have seemed like a tone-deaf miscalculation became, upon closer inspection, something far more consequential. This wasn't just a personal blunder. It was, to many, stirring evidence of priorities that clashed with Britain's own. Even as Edward and Wallis returned to their lives abroad, the shadow of that trip continued to loom. The photographs, the smiles, the salutes, all left an undeniable trace on his legacy. This wasn't something Britain could easily sweep under the proverbial rug. Behind closed doors, his visit added new urgency to the royal family's attempts to manage the damage. For the monarchy, for the government, and for ordinary Britons, the question now became, just how far did Edward's loyalties extend? What if the former King of England, a man once destined to symbolise Britain's unity and strength, became a liability to his country during its darkest hour? When World War II erupted, Edward VIII, now the Duke of Windsor, found himself far removed from duty and further from trust. His wartime chapter was one of accusation, suspicion, and moments of controversy that bordered on treason, controversy that both Britain and its allies worked quietly but relentlessly to bury. In August 1940, Edward accepted an unexpected role, Governor of the Bahamas. For the British government, led by Winston Churchill, this appointment wasn't prompted by admiration or necessity, but by sheer strategy. His stationing 4,000 miles away in the Caribbean served a dual purpose: to ensure his physical safety from Nazi schemes, and more pressingly, to remove him from Europe. By that point, concerns about Edward's sympathies toward Germany were no longer whispered in private. They had become an open secret among key officials, and Churchill knew Edward's proximity to British affairs could risk far more than embarrassment. The Bahamas offered both isolation and a symbolic title that ensured Edward wouldn't wield any real power. But Edward's response to this forced exile revealed much about his priorities. He didn't accept the role out of penitence or an eagerness to serve, but negotiated it with stipulations that showcased his sense of entitlement. He demanded that 2 active duty officers accompany him to the Bahamas as his personal manservants. Even during wartime, when the country faced shortages and the military operated on all fronts, Edward insisted on comforts that reflected his view of authority as a personal privilege. His misgivings about the posting became clear almost immediately. To Edward and Wallis, the Bahamas were little more than a colonial backwater, far removed from the social circles and political opportunities they craved. Yet, despite their complaints, it wasn't their detachment from local governance that alarmed British and American officials. It was the company they kept. Edward and Wallis began associating with wealthy individuals whose ties to Germany raised more than a few eyebrows. Among them was Axel Wenner-Gren, a prominent Swedish businessman with alleged pro-Nazi leanings. Wenner-Gren became a regular fixture in the couple's social life. For Edward, these relationships no doubt felt harmless, even strategic. After all, Edward's self-perception as a mediator remained intact, even after his abdication. He saw little danger in conversations that promoted peace, even with individuals sympathetic to Germany's cause. But to British and US intelligence alike, these associations painted a darker picture. Wenner-Gren, already under suspicion for facilitating German arms deals, seemed an odd choice for Edward's confidences. The couple's activities soon drew the attention of the FBI, whose surveillance noted Edward's discontent with Britain's government and his frequent criticisms of George VI's leadership. Their concerns weren't unfounded. Edward had made alarming claims before. In December 1940, Edward gave an interview to journalist Fulton Osler, famously declaring that Britain should have sought terms with Germany. He reportedly described his belief that his brother, now King George VI, was ill-suited for the crown and openly expressed doubt in Britain's ability to win the war. For Edward, these statements might have felt candid, but for those tracking his influence, they bordered on betrayal. The timing itself couldn't have been worse. That same year, the Battle of Britain had seen devastating losses, with the country still reeling under consistent German air raids. For a former king to suggest capitulation to his younger brother's enemies wasn't just inappropriate, it reflected a dangerous political naivety, if not active sympathy for Britain's foes. Edward's words weren't his only cause for scrutiny. Reports from both British and American intelligence hinted at deeper concerns. Edward's rumoured willingness to pass sensitive information to the Germans. The idea wasn't as implausible as it might seem. Before accepting the governorship in the Bahamas, Edward had privately clashed with members of the royal family over policies that he perceived as needlessly prolonging the war. His frustrations led to speculation that he might have shared insider knowledge, particularly military intelligence, with unwelcome ears. In what remains one of his most infamous moments, some sources even accused him of suggesting that Germany should bomb Britain more strategically to hasten peace. While no verified documents confirm these claims, the fact that they persist speaks volumes about the distrust surrounding Edward at the time. Meanwhile, throughout Europe, the name Edward still carried weight, a dangerous prospect when it became clear that the Nazis had their own plans for him. Operation Willy, an SS plot to kidnap Edward and Wallis, began to materialize in 1940. The initiative sought to bring the couple under German control, with the ultimate aim of reinstalling Edward as a puppet king should the Nazis invade Britain. While the plot never materialized beyond its planning stages, the fact that such a scheme existed revealed just how important Edward remained as a symbolic figure, even to those who wished to overthrow his country. The British royal family, acutely aware of the threat Edward posed, worked tirelessly to manage the damage. Churchill personally intervened on several occasions, issuing stern warnings to Edward about the need for discretion. These private rebukes were later followed by concerted efforts to suppress key aspects of Edward's wartime behaviour. British intelligence began closely monitoring his activities in the Bahamas, informing only the highest echelons of government about what they uncovered. Documents were classified or destroyed altogether, leaving many questions about Edward's role unanswered even decades later. The cover-up wasn't limited to Edward's actions abroad. Even his correspondence was carefully controlled. Security officials intercepted communications between Edward and Wallis and their German acquaintances, ensuring that anything damaging never reached the wrong hands. For the public, this clandestine supervision was entirely invisible. Edward and Wallis were framed as exiles living a quieter life, a narrative that obscured just how much of a liability Edward had become. Even in the Bahamas, evidence of Edward's favour toward fascist sympathisers continued to surface. The Duke often clashed with local officials, particularly over policies he deemed counterproductive to his vision of governance. His proposals rarely focused on the urgent demands of wartime, but instead reflected a stubborn priority toward easing European tensions, even at the expense of Britain's allies. The suspicions grew louder, especially among American intelligence agents stationed in the Caribbean. As allies coordinated to counteract Axis powers, Edward's sideline remarks and controversial social ties became an intelligence issue, not just a royal embarrassment. One of the most critical moments of Edward and Wallis's tenure in the Bahamas occurred when the couple was implicated in financial scandals involving their associates. Wenner-Gren's close relationship with Edward became impossible to ignore, as increasing evidence pointed to his illicit dealings with Nazi Germany. Though Edward's direct involvement in any wrongdoing remains speculative, his proximity alone amplified concerns about his judgment and his loyalty. Perhaps what remains most striking about Edward's wartime chapter is how meticulously the British royal family and government worked to control the fallout. Churchill in particular walked a fine line between protecting Edward as a former member of the monarchy and shielding the country from further scandal. For Churchill, it wasn't only about preserving Edward's reputation, it was about preserving stability at home. A wartime Britain, pressed under the weight of uncertainty and mounting tensions, couldn't afford to be distracted by a scandal tied to its former king. By the war's end, Edward returned to Europe, his reputation forever marked by the years spent in the Bahamas. His sense of betrayal toward his family and his grievances about being sidelined never fully faded, yet Britain had little choice but to keep him at arm's length. The damage Edward might have caused wasn't just theoretical. It reflected what could have been a catastrophic shift in alliances and national morale. His removal to the islands wasn't exile. It was a quiet act of containment. Still, questions linger. How much of Edward's wartime legacy remains locked in classified archives? What other moments of indiscretion or compromise might never come to light? For those who knew him best, Edward was not just a disgraced king, but a potential danger whose actions could not be left unchecked. Even now, his story offers a chilling reminder of how fragile loyalty can become when personal ambition and political instability collide. And as the secrets buried around him suggest, the full scope of his wartime controversy may yet remain untold. What would it take to bury a story capable of shaking the very foundation of a monarchy? For Edward VIII, hiding the truth didn't just protect his reputation, it was essential for national stability. Behind the romanticized tale of abdication lay an extraordinary effort by British leaders, intelligence officials, and even members of the royal family to suppress a scandal that could have caused untold damage during Britain's most vulnerable hour. The effort to rewrite Edward's legacy wasn't swift or simple. It was a carefully orchestrated operation that would stretch across decades. Winston Churchill, the unwavering wartime leader, was one of the key figures behind the cover-up. It wasn't just political savvy that motivated him, but a genuine fear of the harm Edward could inflict on Britain's war effort. Churchill's mistrust stemmed from first-hand knowledge of Edward's sympathies with Nazi Germany and his increasingly unpredictable behaviour. As Prime Minister, Churchill took every opportunity to sideline Edward, sending him far from Europe's theatre of war. But even with Edward safely isolated in the Bahamas, Churchill understood that the former king's reputation remained a potential threat. He worked to make sure that documents and evidence linking Edward to Nazi officials never saw the light of day. Records were classified, destroyed, or buried deep within government vaults. A silent effort designed to protect an institution already under immense stress. But Churchill wasn't working alone. The royal family itself had a vested interest in controlling the narrative. While the abdication was publicly framed as a love story for the ages, figures like George VI and Queen Mary knew there was far more at stake than romance. The missteps Edward took during his short reign and the shadow they cast had to be erased if the monarchy was to restore its dignity and the trust of a war-weary public. One of the most intriguing players in this effort was Anthony Blunt, a member of MI5 and, famously, a Soviet spy. Before his double life was exposed, Blunt undertook a secret mission on behalf of the royal family to retrieve potentially damaging files from Germany. The operation focused on Kronberg Castle, home to Edward's cousin and a senior Nazi officer. While official accounts dismissed the suggestion that these files implicated Edward, some historians argue otherwise. A number of the documents reportedly detailed Edward's wartime activities and his private correspondence, all sealed away, far from public eyes. The secrecy wasn't just about keeping Edward's Nazi ties hidden, but also about controlling the broader narrative around his abdication. The romantic tale of a king giving up his throne for love provided the perfect distraction. It painted Edward as a man of passion, not politics, and conveniently swept aside his statements lauding authoritarian rule, or his naive comments about Hitler's leadership. Publicly, the media played along. British outlets rarely reported on Edward's political leanings or the broader implications of his connections to Nazi officials, especially after he stepped down. Churchill himself had a hand in shaping some of this censorship. Reports reveal that he pressured media outlets at home and abroad to portray Edward in a less controversial light, knowing full well that even whispers of pro-German sentiment could cost the monarchy. This effort extended beyond just silencing the press. Edward's wartime correspondence became another critical area of suppression. British intelligence, aware of the risk posed by his communications, closely monitored his letters and intercepted potential threats. Some documents were quietly placed in archives, inaccessible to anyone outside the highest levels of government. Others were deliberately destroyed to prevent the possibility of future leaks. Even as decades passed, the shadow of this suppression persisted. Files that would normally have been declassified remained sealed, leaving swathes of Edward's story buried under layers of secrecy. In many ways, crafting a carefully controlled version of Edward's legacy served not only to save the monarchy, but also to uphold Britain's image on the world stage. By the time World War II broke out, Europe teetered on chaos, and Britain's leadership understood that instability within the royal family could be catastrophic. King George VI had barely steadied the crown after Edward's abdication, and any revelations of Nazi sympathies linking Edward to the enemy could have shaken Britain's confidence in its own institutions. George's reign, built on quiet professionalism and unwavering service, stood in direct contrast to Edward's controversial tenure. To splinter that image of reliability with tales of Edward's political missteps wasn't an option anyone within the establishment was willing to entertain. The stakes became even clearer as post-war tensions rose. When German foreign policy documents began to surface after the fall of the Third Reich, they contained details about Edward's conversations and apparent complicity with Nazi officials. Among these were his reported frustrations with Britain's refusal to seek peace with Germany and his willingness to envision a Europe ruled under Nazi influence. Churchill personally intervened, ensuring that the British government had a hand in editing these documents when they were finally published. A disclaimer was added to the English edition, downplaying Edward's behavior and framing the disclosures as exaggerated or unreliable. The scale of the cover-up becomes even more revealing when examining those who fought to manage Edward's image well beyond his lifetime. One figure who worked tirelessly to shield the monarchy from scandal was the Queen Mother. As the widow of George VI and a symbol of wartime resilience, she fiercely protected the legacy of her husband's reign. Allowing Edward's story to resurface, or worse, unravel, would have jeopardized the royal family's reputation, built so carefully on the foundation of service and sacrifice. It wasn't just about protecting the dignity of the monarchy, but also about maintaining the loyalty of the nation. Confidence in the crown was critical, not only as a matter of tradition, but also as a source of morale during times when Britain itself was fighting to survive. Scandals involving Edward couldn't be permitted to weaken Great Britain's image as a unified force in the global order. Despite these efforts, not everything could be hidden forever. Leaked records and historical re-evaluations have chipped away at the facade, raising new questions about Edward's wartime activities. At the heart of it all lies the uncomfortable truth. Edward wasn't merely a relic of a failed romantic union. He was a man whose decisions had the potential to change the very fabric of Britain's wartime strategy. His statements and actions revealed a worldview not just unsuited to leadership, but actively harmful to Britain's interests. The deliberate suppression of these facts speaks to how deeply the establishment feared the implications of his story. Even now, the full scope of Edward's activities during and after the war remains elusive. Significant files remain classified, buried behind decades of red tape. While some documents have been declassified, their contents only expose fragmented glimpses into Edward's life. A letter intercepted here, a report redacted beyond recognition there. Speculation persists about the extent of Edward's willingness to cooperate with Germany's vision for Europe, and what discussions might have taken place during his now infamous meeting with Adolf Hitler. The story of Edward VIII offers a striking example of how powerful institutions shape history. The British establishment worked not just to protect its image or its leadership, but also to sustain the narrative that the monarchy symbolized stability and integrity. In Edward's case, they succeeded, at least for a time. For decades, the romanticized version of his abdication and the enduring legend of his love for Wallis Simpson obscured the more troubling depths of his legacy. But as history has shown, truth often resists containment. Little by little, the fragments of Edward's story continue to expose how carefully curated history can be when something or someone is deemed too dangerous for the public to know. And while we may never uncover every detail, the whispers of conspiracy tied to Edward VIII remind us that even kings are not immune to the power of myth-making and secrecy. How much of history, we wonder, remains hidden in the shadows, waiting for the light of discovery? Edward VIII's abdication wasn't the selfless act of romance it appeared to be. It was a carefully orchestrated exit to shield Britain from a king whose loyalties clashed with his country's survival. Far from a love story, it concealed dangerous sympathies and associations that, if exposed, could have shattered trust in the monarchy during a critical moment in history. How many other narratives, like this one, have been shaped to protect powerful institutions? History carries its secrets carefully, layered beneath myths and legends. The question remains, what else might lie hidden in plain sight, waiting for its truth to surface? If you've made it this far, we'd love to hear your thoughts on King Edward VIII in the comments. And if you enjoyed drifting through history with us, please like and subscribe. Another relaxing and intriguing story awaits you next week here on Exhausting Stories.